we do preserve films. We work on film preservation, and Ashley, you can get me their contact information. I could send them a disc of films that we have called The Champion. So these are just small part of our collection. And here you can see, this is the Barrymores, John Barrymore. They lived in Fort Lee, and we named our film center after the Barrymores, even though it's going to be about all film history, not just Fort Lee history. The street it's on Main Street, though, is where a lot of that history took place, but we hope to showcase films not just from Fort Lee, but from around the world, and certainly Korean cinema. We'd love to do that as well. Now I'm going to give you, as a gift, these are for you. These are 2 books that mostly photographs documenting the history that was here. And before you leave, I'll give you another book. So over here, this was Fox. So you can see this was their studio in Fort Lee, their first studio. Most people think, well, that was a small glass enclosed studio. It wasn't really big, but it was a very modern studio. In fact, if you look in here,
the customs to the Main Street right here.
Main Street down, it's about 5 blocks down there.
Yes.
And that is the back lot of Fox when they constructed sets. This was for a Theda Bara film, and William Fox made so much money off her films, he called them super productions, because he put a lot of money into those films, knowing he made them. Now, a lot of people who lived in Fort Lee worked in the film industry, carpenters. A lot of women became film cutters. My grandmother, when she was a little girl, was an extra. Then she became a film cutter. So Fox was one of 17 studios that were in Fort Lee back in the day. But this studio was one of the biggest. Universal and Fox were probably 2 of the biggest studios Fort Lee had back in the day. So we're always collecting material where we can from local people. Now this was Fox Film Corporation. This is what they used to actually carry their film in. Up until a few years ago, they had film, but this goes back to the Fort Lee days. So you can see Fox Film Corporation. That's before it was 20th Century Fox, the merger out in California. And over here, we have this building we saved in Fort Lee. This is a building that was used during the movie days. It dates to the 1860s. It was a saloon. And it was used a lot for movies. The film crews used to have lunch outside here every day, and they used the second floor as an area for the actors and actresses to change during films on location. And as a result, when we went into the house, when we saved it, we found a half a dozen costumes for the silent film period that are in NYU now being restored. So a lot of this material is from that building, and you can see, I'll show you something here. This gentleman right here was a bartender there in the 1910s. His name was Gus Becker. When I was a little boy in Fort Lee, he was still running the bar. He was in his 90s, and that's him. And if you look at that table was there during the movie days, and now that table's right over there. We had that from the family donated the table. But he used to tell us all stories about all the actors and actresses in Fort Lee back in the day. And these are these are some of the bottles that were on his bar when they closed the bar. So that one may have gone back to the movie days. And this is a saddle from Universal. This was used by rodeo people from New York City who were in movies. I got this from their great-granddaughter. She donated to us, and that's images. You can see the image of the hat. That's the same hat. And this was all in Fort Lee. You could tell when a film was in Fort Lee a lot of times because you see the rock of the Palisades, because Fort Lee, very rocky.
Yeah.
So, and I'm going to show you this short. This gives you an idea of what's going on in Fort Lee today with film. I'll take a look at it. It should come up any second now.
American film industry.
Let's go back.
The V.
There we go.
Coming soon, yeah?
Yep, 2020, October.
Over a century ago, America's first film town was born. Fort Lee was home to more than 17 studios, including Universal and Fox Studios, as well as Goldwyn and Selznick, and pioneer filmmakers like Alice Guy Blaché, Oscar Micheaux, D.W. Griffith, Max Sennett, and Mary Pickford. The city's streets, scenic landscapes, and meticulous sets became the backdrop for dramas, comedies, romance, gangster picks, westerns, and swashbuckling films like the 1912 Robin Hood. Fort Lee was also home of the Barrymore family, who made some of their first films here. A young John Barrymore made his stage debut directed by his father, Maurice Barrymore, in the play Man of the World. It was staged at Buckheisters Hotel on the corner of Main Street and Central Road, now known as John Barrymore Way, a block east of the soon-to-be Barrymore Film Center. Fort Lee is once again alive with cinema as the Barrymore Film Center becomes a monument to the birthplace of the American film industry. The BFC will host film festivals from all over, student filmmaker boot camps, filmmaker screenings, and panel discussions.
How many seats?
As well as
260
retrospectives.
seats. We'll be able to show
Emerging artists.
35
The
millimeter,
museum will
70
not only
millimeter,
house
16
displays
millimeter,
of
and
Fort
4K
Lee cinema
digital.
history,
But when we have a big
but
festival,
world
we can
film
expand
history
into
via
the
our
museum.
Loan exhibit.
We'll have video
And the
screens. We can
famed
create
Museum
screens
of the
there,
Moving
and
Images of
upstairs we'll
New
have a
York
gallery and
City
education
will be a
space, so we can
consulting
increase
partner
it
with
there.
the Fort Lee Film
We'll have a
Commission.
2,500 square
As
foot
filmmaking
museum.
continues to evolve and thrive, a new chapter in American cinema
So
will
we're
once again
talking
be
out to,
written and preserved on the streets
museums
of
out in
Fort Lee, New
California,
Jersey,
Hollywood,
in
to
the
borrow
home
material
of
in
the
New York, and we
Barrymore
want to
Film Center.
showcase, like I said, world cinema history, not just Fort Lee history. So that gives you a sense. They're constructing it now. They'll be done with construction in April. We'll get in there, then we'll have to move everything to the new place and get ready, and we're going to open up October 3rd.
October
3rd. So these are some things that we have that we'll bring with us. This is actually 35 millimeter camera that they used in those days. This dates to 1916. We can't be sure it was used in Fort Lee, but we found this in South Jersey from a collector, and that's a professional camera they would have used in Fort Lee. These are some examples of the types of cameras. That was Universal's first studio, which was the champion up in
I
Fort Lee.
have questions. The Main Street theater is only for the movie theater, right? Movie theater, right?
Yes, it's going to be a film center with a film
Film
museum.
center.
Now we can do music and we could do live program as long as it has a hook with film. It's not going to be a performing arts center. It's going to be a film center. But if there's a link to film, like doing a program on film and music, we'll have an orchestra pit where we could actually have musicians in there playing to a silent film or accompanying a new film with music. We want to have a filmmakers boot camp. There's a main violin in Fort Lee. It's they create their own violins and they have their own young musicians. So we're going to work with them to have a young people's orchestras to play along with some of these films. We're going to bring music in from around the country as well. But it could be, we could do like, one of the things we want to do, hopefully, in the next year or two, is have a Korean film festival and bring Korean filmmakers to explain and introduce their films. We just don't want to show a film. We want to have either the filmmakers or people there to discuss the film. We want to make it a special experience. So we'll be open 7 days a week.
So opening is October 3rd, right?
October 3rd of this coming year we open
So
up.
you have a schedule something?
We're working on a schedule. The first exhibit, we have the first 3 exhibits scheduled. The first exhibit's going to be on the Barrymores. Now, it's not a museum to the Barrymores. We named it after them. But the first exhibit will be about the Barrymores. That'll run from October till February. Then we're going to have, from March until the fall of 2021, we're going to have a women filmmakers exhibit. That's not going to just be about women in film in Fort Lee, but across the country and the world. We're partnering with Columbia University. They're doing a women's film project, so they'll be bringing over scholars, things like that. We're talking to collectors about bringing these classical Hollywood costumes in, things like that. And then our third exhibit, which opens in the fall of 2021, is going to be a Universal horror exhibit. We're working with the Museum of Natural History in Los Angeles. They have most of Universal's artifacts from their classic horror films, from Frankenstein, Dracula, The Wolfman, Creature from the Black Lagoon. We're going to borrow all that and bring it here because Universal actually made their first horror film in Fort Lee in 1913. And one of the locations where they shot this film, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, still exists. It's a church in West Fort Lee. So we're going to bring that in. So that's our first 3 exhibits. In terms of a film program, we're working right now. Obviously, the first week we'll be doing some Barrymore films. But going into the fall, every Saturday we'll have a classic cinema whether it's American film or foreign film, classic film, late Saturday morning, Saturday nights. Then we'll go to a regular schedule. None of this will be first run. It'll be more art house films, more classic American and foreign films, films of emerging filmmakers, kids making films in Columbia, NYU, things like that. And we will do our own film festival there. And we'll bring in groups to do their own film festivals. But we're working, so we come over here, I'll show you one of the things we're keen on, and this is going to be done either in the fall or spring of next year. This is, we hooked up with the French Embassy in New York. Now, the French, during the time of filmmaking in Fort Lee, the French were leading the way in terms of the technical aspect of film. Nobody was making films as advanced as the French, but the French saw that the biggest ticket-paying audience for film in the world was in America. So they built studios in Fort Lee. We had so many French filmmakers in Fort Lee living here back then that they had their own French-language newspaper. This was one of them, Alice Guy Blaché. She started as a secretary for Gaumont in Paris in the 1890s, and by the early 1900s, she was head of production in Gaumont, and by 1912, she came to Fort Lee and built her own studio, Solax, where she wrote, directed, and produced films. So that's members of the French Embassy in New York City. We're working with them for once a year to do a French film festival, where they're going to bring French filmmakers in, and we'll showcase new French films, and they'll talk about the films, and then we'll show some of these French films that were made here when we were doing silent films. So we hope to connect with the South Korean Embassy to do the same thing, where we could bring Korean filmmakers in here to showcase films, because we all know Korean, it's not just because there's a good population of Koreans in here, but in terms of film parasite, I don't need to tell you, I mean, your Korean film is cutting edge today, so we want to bring that to Fort Lee as well. So we'd love to do something to showcase Korean cinema. So that's some of the things we want to do, not just classic American films, but films from around the world. The more that we can do, the better. Right now, some of the programs we're working on in the fall will be, we're going to do something on Disney. Netflix had a documentary called Floyd Norman, An Animated Life. He's the last living animator that Walt Disney hired. He's still working at Disney. We're going to bring him in. We saw him out in California in October. We're going to bring him in to do a program with us for a weekend highlighting Disney films. We'll bring in Leonard Maltin. We're talking to some people about possibly getting Oliver Stone to come in to do a film festival with us. We're so close to New York, when they come in here, we could get these celebrities to come in and do things for us. So we're working on our schedule as we speak. Probably by the spring, we'll have our schedule all set from October 3rd through the end of this year. And by the summer, we'll have our schedule for the next year as well. So we're projecting out. We have a person we're hiring who's going to be a film buyer for us, things like that. Now these, that's the Fox studio I was telling you before. That's their back lot. Well, that rock is still there. We've done things to promote the history of film in Fort Lee. So we put signs up where the studios were. That brings awareness. We do tours. We like to look at the films that still exist and find the locations. So this was a film shot in 1918, and this is an easy one because you could see that statue, and it was shot right outside this window here in 1918 by World Pictures, which was a Selznick film. All of these glass slides are from Fort Lee Films. They use these to promote the films. They would blow them up on the screen, put them in a magic lantern like that, and it was like coming attractions, basically. And these are some of the studios that were in Fort Lee. This is all their logos. Universal, when we talked to Universal several years ago, they never had that logo because they left everything in Fort Lee. They never brought anything back out to California. So they thought their first logo was out in California, but in fact, their first logo was here. This is the first American gangster film. This was shot on Main Street. It's called The Musketeers of Pig Alley. You can still see it. It's on YouTube. It's a great film. And that's our connect with Scorsese, because Scorsese came into Fort Lee to shoot parts of Goodfellas years ago because he knew that D.W. Griffith shot the first gangster film here. And we still have filmmakers coming into Fort Lee. This is a Universal TV show, Law and Order. They were here a lot. Those are images of early women filmmakers. These two, this is the beginnings of American comedy here. Max Sennett and Mabel Normand. They both started in Fort Lee. And we're going to highlight that by bringing in a comedy festival once a year to highlight the history of comedy, the fact that a lot of that started here. And if we go in here, this is about an amusement park that was in Fort Lee from 1898 to 1971, but From 1910 to 1935, it was owned by these two gentlemen, Nicholas and Joseph Skank. They were also movie men, and their partner was Marcus Lowe, and in 1924 they formed Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM. They owned the park till 35. Joe ended up becoming president of MGM. This was a gentleman who lived in Fort Lee, was born in Fort Lee, Eddie Mannix. If you read any history about MGM, look in the back, you'll see a lot about Eddie Mannix. He was good friends with my grandmother. When these guys bought the park in 1910, they had a lot of problems because there were teenagers breaking in and stealing things. But these guys were good businessmen. They didn't call the police department. They called the head of the gang, which was Eddie Mannix.
Gangster.
Yeah, and they hired him to be head of security.
Right.
So when they got MGM, well, see, this is an interesting part. Max Sennett had his studio in California, Keystone. He started that here. 1916, he sent his troupe out to Fort Lee and rented studio space where Fox was. And he wasn't here, but he sent them to make films. And this was Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, made a lot of films for them, directed films. But Max Sennett never paid a lot of money. That's why Charlie Chaplin left him. And so Joe Skank hired Roscoe Arbuckle away from Sennett, and Joe opened up a studio in New York City, and that's where Buster Keaton first started making films, in Fort Lee in New York. And by the time that they formed MGM with Marcus Lowe in 1924, they put Louis B. Mayer in head of production. They knew he'd do a good job, but they didn't trust him, so they sent Eddie Mannix out there to be superintendent of the MGM lot. And he was superintendent of the lot until he died in 1963. He outlasted the Skanks and Louis B. Mayer. But I went out to the Academy Archive in California. A lot of good stuff on Eddie. So this was very much connected to the movie industry when it was in Fort Lee, the amusement park. And this is I can get you a copy of this. If I could get one to Ashley, she could send it to you. But this is a documentary we did a few years ago on the film industry in Fort Lee. We went to the Library of Congress and found a number of films we restored that were shot in Fort Lee. And we put this out through Milestone Films. They're basically from New Jersey, but they're really good in film restoration projects. So we did that. And we're working on a documentary that will show when the Barrymore opens up. It's going to be about the Barrymore family. So we've been shooting a lot in New York City because they had a lot. Obviously, the Barrymores were connected to the Broadway stage. And that's why the movies, in a sense, came to Fort Lee. So we were so close to Broadway that they could bring the stars over here. And yet, this community, this was before the bridge was here, this was a very rural community, so it was, and people here loved the movie industry because it provided jobs. So it was close to Manhattan, but it was like a big back lot. You know, if they went down Main Street, they'd get any Main Street in America. If they went a half a mile to the cliffs, you'd get action adventure films. If they went to the north of the town, they could shoot westerns because it wasn't really populated. It was a lot of small cottages and open fields. So it was almost, that's how it started, as a back lot. And by 1910, they started building studios here. So by 1910, we had the first studio. 1915, we had 17 studios. So it went. So the industry, the interesting part of Fort Lee, when the industry started here, this is a replica, which doesn't work, we have to fix it, but it's a replica of a kinetoscope. When the industry started in Fort Lee, this is how people watched movies. When the industry blew up in Fort Lee, and before it went to Hollywood, they were building these picture palaces in Manhattan, big movie houses. So it went from the Nickelodeon period to a real industry. So that's why what we're documenting here is we think is special, and right where the cinema, the film center is going to be located is really the area where all these studios started, and we were the first studio town. They just took that template and brought it to Hollywood. But before you leave, I'm going to get you another book because it's a good book.
About Fort Lee, right?
Yes, all about Fort Lee. Yeah, the next book I'm going to give you, in fact, stay here for a second, I'll get the book. It gives you a chapter by chapter analysis of every studio in Fort Lee. So you can look at Fox, you can look at Universal. So let me get that, I'll be right back. Just 1 second. It's one of the 5 Fox Wonder Theaters, and now it's the United Palace. It's been a church since about 1968. But that's good because everything's preserved. The church is now leasing space to a nonprofit that's doing films there. So we'd like to do it Across the River Film Festival, where we do this program in this beautiful 1929 cinema, and also with us, you know. So, and we're talking to TCM about doing some programming with them as well. They have a film noir program with Eddie Muller that they show all these classic film noirs, and you know, that was shot in Hollywood. There were a lot shot in New York. There were a lot shot around the world. We could do something with that. So it's nothing we can't do once we get in there.
And the Barrymore Film Center will be completed sometime in March?
Yes, March 26th, they
March
said we'll get the
26th,
keys.
Tentative,
right
that's
now.
our
And then we go
schedule.
inside, we already bought our projectors, we have to outfit everything, we have to hire a staff.
Or
Yeah,
Korean Cultural Center as well, so.
Once we make a lot of money, we could do that. Right now, because we're a creature of the municipality, so we have a budget with the town. That's why the town let us form a nonprofit, so we could raise additional money, so we can do other things, like bring people in, things like that, acquire, artifacts that we may want, do programs for kids. We want to do an aggressive filmmakers boot camp in the summertime for kids in the tri-state area. A lot of them in Fort Lee, we worked with in the past, were Korean American kids, and they've gone on to NYU, things like that. We want to expand out to cover the entire state and New York as well. And one of the things we think, we're so close to the city, we're trying to promote this as a place for people from New York City to come to as well, because there's not many repertory houses left in Manhattan like there used to be to see classic film. You have the Film Forum, the Metrograph, Angelica, Landmark's not here anymore, you got Lincoln Center, so you have about 5 or 6 and that's it. So we want to do something along those terms. But we definitely want to reach out and do include Korean cinema in what we do, absolutely. And the more cinema we can do like Korean, like French, and other nations, it indicates, that even though this is the American film industry, but a lot of people who were here, even in the beginning of the industry, came from other countries. You see, France, the French were here. And if it was from America, you had a pioneering African-American filmmaker, Oscar Michaud, making films in Fort Lee from 1920 to 1948 when he died, because he couldn't make them out in California because of discrimination. So this was a very diverse filmmaking population in Fort Lee. And the interesting thing is, when I mentioned women before, there were a lot of women in front of the camera and behind the camera in Fort Lee. When the industry went to California, that kind of ended. There wasn't as many women involved, certainly not directing and producing. But when it was Fort Lee, it was a new industry. So it was a lot of people can get into that industry, which was kind of cool. So yeah, so this is what's going to happen in the next few months. We're excited about it.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can talk, and you guys can talk too. We'd love to involve you in it.
It's gonna be completely.
March
March
26th, March 26th.
Pretty much,
March, yes, we
And
open then.
yeah.
I mean, we get the keys. It's gonna
Yeah.
take us until October to get everything
Nice,
set.
yeah.
So we'll get in there March 26th, hopefully, but definitely October 3rd we open up. And that's my card there.
And October, hopefully that, with your connection, you can bring some Korean film, like a premieres to this
And if you're
area.
if you're here, we'd love to invite you to the opening.
But
Yeah,
this is because
absolutely.
it's Korean.
That's
why.
okay.
Just keep
I happen to know
remember.
somebody in Korea who
Yeah.
knows
Figure
Korean.
it out when you
Translate.
Thank you.
Right?
So
Thank
he has
you.
a great connection.
Good,
We have.
good.
He's a producer as
Oh,
well
great.
as a film director.
Well, we'd love to have, anytime you want to shoot anything in Fort Lee, come here, because one of the things, we fought very hard, the Fort Lee Film Commission, to get a tax credit back for film and TV production. For 8 years, our former Governor Christie got rid of the tax credit, so New York was getting all of the production and we were getting nothing. So now we have an aggressive tax credit. So actually, about 3 miles from here at the Meadowlands, they have an old arena called the now it's the Izod Center. That's NBC Universal's leasing it, hopefully for 5 years. Now they're using it for film and television again. So we hope to have more production back in Fort Lee as well. They're doing production in Patterson and Newark, all over the state now because of the tax credit. So we'd love to get production back
Yeah,
in
you
Fort
can
Lee.
actually spread out when you go to Korea and bring all that producers.
Because we still have what we had before. We had Netflix come in to shoot part of a series a couple of weeks ago, and they used the cliffs of the Palisades. The same thing they did over 100 years ago with Pearl White. So we still have the same diverse land, really, if you think about it. We still have a very urban main street, very diverse, a lot of Korean businesses. You go on the cliffs of the Palisades, it looks like it did 100 years ago. You got a lot of open space, you got beautiful vistas of Manhattan, and you got the cliffs. You go to the north of town, you have smaller homes. So it's still something of a back lot aspect to it. And if you go, which I like to tell people, across from the Barrymore Film Center now, you look down the street and you have all these 19th century wooden buildings. That used to be Main Street up until the 1970s. And if you were shooting a film, you could shoot it there and it looks like it's 1900. Then you turn and you see these 2 towers and it looks like the 21st century. So it's still like a back lot, I mean, I remember being on Warner Brothers back a lot of civil
I
rights.
graduated in Chuang University. You know,
Oh,
Chuang
okay, yeah,
University
yeah.
is very famous.
Yes,
theater,
yes,
theater,
yes,
city,
yes.
one of
Right,
Korea
right.
University.
Wow, that's terrific.
Yeah,
That's
so
terrific. So you know your stuff. That's very good. Yeah. So we'd love to get involved with you and do something with you. It's going to be great, and it's again the best thing we have, the greatest advantage we have, in addition to the support of the town and the help of people like Ashley on our board, is the fact that we have this film history, and we could jump off. The same thing with women filmmakers. So we could use this history and then show a lot of new stuff. I think so. So that's our advantage here. So I hope you're here October 3rd. If you are, you're invited.
You're coming back when? He's
No.
leaving on the 5th.
Fifth.
To Korea.
So after 3 weeks,
And then
I like
3
that.
weeks.
Oh, you're gonna be back then?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then
Okay.
that's why he's meeting with the,
Oh, okay,
the
okay,
film
okay.
industry
So
in
very
Korea.
correct,
and
so-
just
Okay.
tell-
I just want to explain about my friend.
Okay. Good.
Okay,
Yeah. That'd be great. Please
Yeah,
do.
so I just step by.
And when you come back, we'll get you inside the place.
Yes, then we're gonna
Yeah.
tour.
Yes.
Absolutely. And anybody you want, we can bring them inside there.
Because if I have a question or something,
Yes.
so let me.
Yes,
Yes,
and then
exactly.
then I will just
How much-
relate.
Yes,
that.
absolutely.
Sure.
Thank you so much for
Thank
coming.
you.
I appreciate it. Happy New Year. It's a pleasure meeting
Thank
you.
you.
Hope to see you again soon.
Tom, thank you so much.
Oh,
for your
thank
time.
you. Always. Please.
Sorry.
This is good for us. Anytime you want to talk about film and bring film in from Korea,
Oh
I'm
my
all
goodness,
for it.
you're like a encyclopedia. I mean, he knows all that in years. And
You learn it all. Well, you know this film is like archaeology. You learn something new all
You
the
have
time.
go in, you know.
Yeah.
you gotta
Well, you know what? I was
Yeah.
lucky when I was born. A lot of the people
Right,
who
that's
were
what's
here,
up.
they told me like that bartender. Because years ago, today they would call the police, but years ago, you know, in the early 70s, late 60s, kids could actually go in a bar. So we go in a bar as a kid. You know, it was a small little side street, and we go in.
Hour 4, 5 hour, no problem without book. You can explain. to
Yeah,
me.
go ahead. Go. All right, good
No
seeing
problem.
you.
Uh-huh.
Good seeing you.
So,
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you again.